We are grateful to be here. My name is Ian Mitra. I'm the Senior Managing Editor for the Texas Tribune and the Secretary on the board for the Freedom of Information Foundation of Texas. Thank you so much for being part of this conference and for joining us here and for this really incredible panel. We've got a really like an all-star roster here to talk journalism and records. So I'm just going to do brief introductions. You've got broader introductions in your program. I got a few questions I'm going to ask. We're going to open it up to Q&A. We want to make sure you have a chance to ask questions, and we'll just get going. I'm going to start from the far end, introducing Tony Plahetsky, who's been at the Austin American Statesman since 2010 and 2010? 2000. Since 2013, you've been working with KViews. That's right. Yeah. Okay, thanks. And what is there an award you haven't won? National Murrow Headliner Foundation Hillman Award.
There are a couple.
Speaking of award-winning journalist Lauren McGahee from the Dallas Morning News, she's an investigative reporter focusing on gender, sexuality, and politics. Before that, Lauren had stints at the Houston Chronicle and the Times-Picayune in New Orleans. And closest to me is Mario Oriana, who's the assistant news director at KSAT in San Antonio. Started there in 1995. Worked as a sports producer and news editor, and then as news producer before your current position. Welcome to you all. Thanks for being here. I know we've talked a lot in previous panels about Uvalde, but I think this is still a good place to start and to talk, because each of the panelists here have their own unique experience and insight into the tragedy and the aspects of reporting and bringing transparency to this horrible tragedy. And Tony, I want to start with you, because obviously you wrote the story, and the Statesman and KView produced brought footage to people who had been clamoring for it for a long time and weren't getting answers from elected officials, government officials. And so, could you talk a little bit about the work that you had to do to get even access to this, and the whole process of being able to produce the video, and the kind of the thought process and working to get access, and to the decision making as to why to produce it?
Sure. Thank you all for being here and for your questions in advance. And I just want to say I'm so honored to be with my co-panelists, and thank you for moderating today. Certainly, our Uvalde coverage has been, I think I can say without question, the most difficult of my career. There have been not only, as we all know, very public fights for records, but also some of the records that we have obtained either through sourcing or through official releases have been filled with all sorts of editorial and ethical decisions that we have encountered and reconciled, and very difficult decisions that have had to be made. But I think that just as a starting point, I think that Uvalde has highlighted in a beneficial way to working journalists the difficulty that we do have obtaining records here in the state. Again, I know some of this has been discussed previously today, but we face a very difficult situation and many hurdles, frankly, when a suspect is killed during a criminal encounter. Texas law leaves a lot of discretion and a lot of latitude to investigating agencies. And what we have seen in this case repeatedly is that they have declined to release much information at all. They have exercised a number of exemptions that are afforded to them in the law. And so what that has meant is that for journalists like me and my colleagues at other newspapers and publications, television stations, online publications across the state, is that we have had to rely very often on sources to get us information. That has happened in a number of instances We, along with the Texas Tribune, for example, were among the first media outlets in the nation to get screen grabs in June, about 3 weeks after the shooting, that showed a gathering of law enforcement officials, dozens of them, in the hallway of Robb Elementary. And then some weeks after that, we were able to obtain the 77-minute video that showed in real time officers gathering in the hall, but sadly and unfortunately taking no real action for more than an hour to enter the classroom where the gunman was with those 19 children and 2 teachers.
Lauren, you have done some specific records requests of your own related to the Uvalde. Could you just talk about your efforts and just kind of like the roadblocks that you've kind of faced and kind of how you've been working through that?
Sure. I want to thank the reporters that have done the bulk of the work there. It's been almost 5 years since the Sutherland Springs shooting, and I told them that it was too soon for me to go back to another scene like that. So I did not want to go. I filed a handful of requests because I was curious about previous residences where the deceased gunman lived. And so I got kind of thrown into this big pot of requesters who asked for records. And this is kind of my pitch for the audience and for people who are interested in how that process works. In August, we finally got the records ruling from the Attorney General's office. You can find this online now that it's a public record. It was released on August 12th. So if you want to look it up, it is OR 2022-24126. And this was what was released to every single person who asked for a record. It's a lump response. So it says there were 162 requests from 92 requesters for information, and all of the answers, as much as we can glean, are in this document. It's really, there's a lot of answers in here for how the state is dealing with records right now. If you read through it, you can really get a sense of what they're considering public and what they aren't. And so it's everything from the date of birth redaction problem that was talked about on the last couple of panels, to what law enforcement information should be considered confidential, to what is considered embarrassing and intimate information for city officials. So read it; it's very informative. But my experience just more generally was the city has contracted with a private law firm, which is happening more and more with cities. And so you go through the law firm; you don't go through a city attorney. And in my experience, it was a very different relationship. It was much harder to get questions answered, or basically impossible. They came later than I've experienced with public bodies that seem to be more familiar with the law. And then when I tried to figure out how much they were being paid, I was told that there was no records about that. And it was a few weeks before I realized that they were a law firm that is part of a state kind of insurance consortium that smaller cities can pay into, and then they can get legal representation from that group. But instead of just telling me that, they said there's no records, and then I said why, and then I filed another records request that was a little more honed, and they said there's still no records, and I didn't know why until I found out that it was because they weren't being paid by the city; they were being paid through a third channel. So it's been a lot of waiting, but you can see the volume of requests would overwhelm, especially a small municipality. And so I hope that later on the panel we can talk about government investment in personnel for records. As we've heard, there are more people filing them, and our especially from the legislative angle, our agency heads asking for that, and their LARs, which are now their legislative appropriations requests for next year, are coming out. Are they asking for more personnel? Is that what those records personnel need? Do they need more colleagues, or do they need something else? Like what would make their jobs easier for them? Or is it a problem with the statute itself? So where does the investment needed?
Thank you. Yeah, and we will definitely touch more on looking ahead to the legislative session and the things that, hopefully, if we have some dream scenarios of what we hope happen too. Mario, your station's parent company is Graham Media, and they're part of the lawsuit that this consortium of news organizations has filed against DPS seeking more access to records. Can you talk about this consortium, just the whole aspect of this, and just kind of, from your perspective, just kind of the importance of this and what people need to know about this effort?
Absolutely. Again, thank you for having me. Honored to be up here with everybody. But, we are part of the media consortium that is actually one of the, Haynes Boone here, the lead attorney in this for Graham Media. And it's been brought up in panels before. It shouldn't get to this point where this is the norm to get these records that the public have a right to know about a tragedy that happened in our backyard. KSAT, we're the ABC affiliate in San Antonio, and I've been at KSAT for 26 days, and that was one of the darkest times. And it's hard to rebound from that as a father, and but as a journalist, it's where you know now what needs to be done. And when there's roadblocks that prevent you from getting that kind of information to the public, the vital information that my colleagues here have talked about, that it shouldn't get to this point where there should be a shared media group suing DPS to get these vital records, to find out what happened on that really, really dark day. And, I'm looking over our story. Laura Prather said it. This is the goal of the lawsuit, and the exemptions that are being asserted by DPS are entirely discretionary. They are things they can choose to hide or they can choose to disclose. And here we are. So that is, as there was a talk about in a previous panel about TV or news outlets combining their efforts together to find this kind of information. And I've been in TV for quite some time, and it's hard for me to still wrap my head around that because it's when you've competed with other news outlets for so long, that's your first nature. But I believe all news outlets, everybody has the right to know everything that happened there. And I hate that this is the point that it's come to, but this is where it's at. And I agree with what was said earlier in one of the panels. This might be, part of the new norm. It's exhausting. It shouldn't be that way. I do want to bring up a point a former intern here brought up in a previous panel, Rasika here, that we talked about a story. It's a dark comparison, but it is unfortunately the times we live in, of comparing the response for the Highland Park shooting, that happened right after, and seeing the response and seeing the information that came out as comparative to Uvalde, Parkland, Newtown. That it pains me that is where we have to compare, but we see that there is better ways of doing this. And so it was essentially a no-brainer to get involved in this media consortium on this lawsuit.
There's other things that we will probably get to, but before we move on from Uvalde, I just want to kind of ask all three of you just kind of, what this group and what we should take away from your experience, and just, obviously we've talked about the consortium, we've talked about the battle to get records, we've talked about how this is a situation where if we cannot get transparency on what's happening, then when are we going to get transparency? But just really, a question, maybe Tony, I'll start with you, of just like, what should this group take away from your experiences covering this?
I think at the end of the day, there are choices that get made by the government. They can choose a position of openness and transparency or not. And clearly, in this case, they are choosing, for the most part, again, there have been a couple of exceptions to that, but globally, they're choosing not to release information. I think one of the things that I just want to say, too, that has been particularly frustrating to me is how this is all getting talked about among our officials in terms of their explanations, their public-facing explanations, in terms of why they are choosing not to release information. So, for example, our governor, Greg Abbott, will in many ways call for transparency, but yet not say that the Texas Department of Public Safety is his agency. So presumably he could put his finger on the scale toward transparency. Colonel Steve McCraw, who heads the Texas DPS, continuously cites a request by the Uvalde DA that his agency, DPS, and the Texas Rangers not release information. Yet at the same time, the information is within his purview to release it. And so he is making a policy administrative decision to comply with the DA, which is not entirely unusual among investigating law enforcement agencies. But at the same time, it has been my experience at different times to see an investigating law enforcement agency depart from the request of a DA when, for example, they believe that this information should be made public. So it has been frustrating to me to sort of watch these different explanations to the public. But again, at the end of the day, I think all of the investigating bodies involved in the Uvalde case are making a decision, and it is against transparency, unfortunately.
I just want to underscore what you said about discretionary decisions and what you were saying too. Again, in the ruling, it points that out repeatedly. The person at the AG's office who wrote this ruling said lots of this information is now up to the city, and then sometimes the city and DPS or DPS whether they want to release this information. So leaving that in their hands, writing into statute that certain things are up to them, then we have to see what decisions are they making and what is their reasoning for doing that. And just for an example, I understand that there's all kinds of information that might have come out from these records. Some of it, I'm sure they could make an argument that needs to be withheld because of certain reasons, right? But there's a section in here that says that DPS objected to releasing information about an ongoing criminal investigation, and it said, we note the information at issue includes parking tickets. Because copies of the traffic tickets were provided to the individuals who were cited, we find release of the traffic tickets will not interfere with the detection, investigation, or prosecution of a crime. So they cannot be withheld. These are kinds of things. Why are they trying to withhold parking tickets? Why are we doing the extra work? Why are they going the extra mile for that if it's a public record?
I'm going to bring up, because I'm sure it's going to be, and it's been talked about, the dead suspect loophole. And, we, all of us have done stories on that. And I want to kind of talk about a local professor, UTSA, what he talked about specifically to that. When the governor is saying that he's been what he felt was lied to, that tells you there's a crying need for eliminating the loophole in Texas. But yet, as you said, has signed, he has signed it into law. He has refused to close it, and it can be easily closed. That is one of the obstacles, big obstacles in this lawsuit that is being talked about. And I know Speaker Phelan has talked about it on the next legislative session for it to be a priority, and obviously that would be our media organization's top priority as well.
Thank you all. I want to move on to some other things that you have each covered and talk about your work on some of these stories. And Tony, I'll start with you again here. And I wanted to ask you about the Javier Ambler story that you wrote about, and obviously the level of transparency that wasn't there before your reporting. Could you talk a little bit? I'll just let you describe the case and your reporting, and also just kind of like your fight to get the truth out and to let people know about what was really going on.
Javier Ambler was a 40-year-old black father who lived in Williamson County, the county just to the north of Austin. And in February 2020, I received a tip that I should begin looking into his death. And I, at that point, began a number of open records requests to try to learn information from Williamson County and the Williamson County Sheriff's Office about what happened to him. They blanketly refused to release information and appealed to the Attorney General's office. But at that point, I began working law enforcement sources here in Travis County, where Ambler actually died. The facts of the case are this: he did not dim his headlights to oncoming traffic and a year earlier in 2019, and was actually chased into Austin and Travis County by Williamson County deputies. At the time, those deputies had in their police cars with them a crew from a reality television show called Live PD. It was a very popular, highly rated show on A&E. And ultimately, Javier Ambler crashed his car. The deputies used tasers on him multiple times as he was shouting that he had congestive heart failure and could not breathe. And Javier Ambler died in their custody on the side of an Austin street. But really, that's an example, too, where authorities refused to release much of the information, citing the dead suspect loophole. And I think that one of the really important things about that case is that it also highlights how, as journalists, we can often be in this situation of having to almost negotiate with a police chief or a district attorney for them to release information. And in that case, ultimately, I was able to, through strenuous conversations with them, pleading, honestly, at times with them, to release the dash camera video and body camera video of Mr. Ambler's death, and they ultimately did. But the truth is, as I was thinking about, preparing for this panel, it really should not work that way. The information is public information. It should be public information. This was very much a public encounter. It was recorded by cameras that are bought and paid for by taxpayers. And so while we were ultimately successful in getting many of the records that helped shed light and tell the story of what happened that night, again, it really left it up to us to argue, negotiate, compel, whatever the verb you want to use is. And while that can be effective, at the end of the day, I do not think that the public interest is really served by that in terms of everyone having access and equal access to important records.
Thanks. Lauren, you led an effort to try to get access to records related to Ken Paxton's appearance at the January 6th rallies. Could you talk a little bit about the effort, kind of, because it wasn't just you also collaborated with other journalists from other media organizations as well, led this effort. Could you talk a little bit about kind of the genesis of that effort, what you were trying to get, and kind of how things stand now?
Sure. I'll say that I helped lead an effort to get those records. This was yet another consortium of news media organizations that were seeking various records from the Attorney General's office about his visit to Washington during the same time as the January 6th attack on the Capitol. He spoke at a rally before. And we were summarily denied many of the communications. So we banded together, and we actually did file a complaint with, our editors of the news organizations filed a complaint on behalf of the organizations that they believe that the AG was potentially violating the law in the blanket denial. And I mean, the long and short of it is the DA was going to sue for those records, but wanted reporters to take the stand and testify in open court. And, we deal with confidential sources a lot. We had concerns about that. We thought that our editors thought that the complaint stood on its merits and could be pursued, and because that was the ask, then the news organization said no, and for all appearances, it appears that that is now dead. So we probably won't ever have access to that information that we sought. So, sometimes we do go to the extra mile and do what we think we can to get access to information that has not been turned over, and it still doesn't pan out in the end. So,
Had you heard anything about whether this type of kind of, this whole aspect of like having journalists testify, had you heard about this happening elsewhere in other states or anything? This seems very like...
I don't know. I feel like all I do is read about Texas. I'm like so I'm so honed here. Does anyone else have any experience with that?
We have been subpoenaed quite a bit on our video, raw video for interviews, which I equate to a reporter's notebook, which I just would not let.
Yeah.
But as far as other states, I don't know. I'm with you. I only know about Texas. But yeah, I know that has become commonplace.
Mario, I want to ask about KSAT's report about the Medina Valley ISD athletic director who eventually resigned after reporting that your news organization did. Could you talk a little bit about the work that you did and the records that you got to break that story?
Well, I would put that work on our investigative team, Dylan Collier and Josh Saunders, photojournalist. I assistant news director, kept tabs on this story, but they are well-seasoned veteran investigative team that this all started with a tip. This all started with the tip that the athletic director was, there was a public, and forgive me if the details are, I don't have this story memorized here, but that the district would not provide additional details on why he was being fired, why he was being let go. During this time, he was investigated, or there was complaints about drug use, yet he was still allowed to drive a school bus. There were complaints about his time, not only was when those complaints were out, he was still promoted, kept getting promoted. And it wasn't until we requested that this came to light. The Medina Valley community knew about this through hearsay, and a small community like that, you're going to know. And we got down to the bottom of it, and eventually the athletic director or head football coach, which we know in Texas, it's a sacred job, lost his job, blamed us for it. But we were proud of the way we reported that particular story, and stood by it. Forgive me if I don't know the details as much as I should. But I certainly know I certainly heard from some of the concerned parties.
Yeah, thanks. Tony, you've mentioned this a couple of times, which is, the whole aspect of the reliance on human sourcing and proactive human sourcing. This is, I'll start with you, but if anyone else wants to jump in, because we have such a great experienced group of journalists here, could you talk about the trends that you've seen related to that aspect of it? Like, obviously we're talking about the tightening of records and stuff like that, but this increased reliance on that ability of sourcing and stuff. And these are important stories that you've all been a part of. Could you talk a little bit about that trend that you've seen over the courses of your time as journalists?
Sure. I mean, certainly good sourcing and developing good sourcing is something that, as journalists, I think we cherish and celebrate, and earning the trust of people who are willing to provide records to us, is something, again, that I think at times we can really celebrate. But at the same time, from a more public standpoint, I do wonder if I should have access to records that someone, by simply knowing someone, that a citizen of our community or of our state should not have equal access to. As journalists, we often, or always for that matter, work on behalf of the public, but it does make me uncomfortable that these are public records that we have to almost surreptitiously go about doing that should be made public through an open records request. Having said that, I'll just say, in my own experience, the need to rely upon human sources continues to grow, particularly as law enforcement agencies cite all kinds of exceptions for releasing information, as we have seen. And so I think in many ways that highlights the need for strong journalists and strong journalism in our community, in our state, across the country for that matter, because I do think as the door continues to close on access to information, we are going to have to work harder to find people who trust us to give us information when the public needs it and is demanding it.
Lauren, we talked before about attorney-client privilege and just kind of the aspects of just kind of like how that seems the citing of attorney-client privilege has changed, and you've seen some of that. Could you talk a little bit about kind of what you've noticed about that?
Sure. Certain records can be withheld because of attorney-client privilege, right? You have a conversation with your attorney, and it's regarding a lawsuit or potential lawsuit that shouldn't be made public. But I find that it's being cited a lot in recent rulings, records rulings that I'm getting back from the AG. These are 4 denials recently that I got for very different things, all citing just attorney-client privilege. And one that I find really curious, as an example, is public officials' calendars. So where were they on certain days? It's becoming more and more important when we're trying to figure out who's funding state official travel to political events, or to, for example, January 6th, who paid for so-and-so to go there. Was he there as a state official? Was he there as, someone running for a political office, so more from a campaign perspective? And so the calendars become important. Also, who are elected officials relying on to form their views? Who are they meeting with? There was a recent request I made for some calendars that got kicked to the AG, and the opinion cites attorney-client privilege for making redactions from the calendar. So I got the calendars, but there were several redactions in them, and the redactions for attorney-client privilege were for meetings on the calendar. So it would be so-and-so met with so-and-so at this time. And they just took that meeting right off the calendar because they said it was pertaining to some litigation. That is something that I don't believe I had seen in the past. If the AG records person is in the room, they can they can correct me. Maybe this has always been the case, but I've gotten calendars a lot before and don't recall getting specific just person A and person B met, and therefore that meeting is redacted from the calendar. Outside counsel, a lot of state agencies, or more and more state agencies, are relying on outside counsel instead of internal counsel, and they're redacting. They're withholding communications that have to do with outside counsel, even if it's not with that attorney or that agency themselves. They're withholding communications with political groups who are interested in litigation if it has to do with litigation, citing the litigation. So I just, there are sometimes when I see these well-meaning portions of the records law cited in ways that I don't understand, and I wish I had more insight into why they're being tapped so frequently, but it does feel like it's becoming more of a problem, for my purposes at least.
Thanks, Lauren. Before we get into kind of looking ahead to the legislative session, Mario, I do want to follow up on another story that KSAT did, which was involving a San Antonio Police Department internal affairs investigator who basically kind of talked about how command staff had covered up a sex scandal involving a captain and an officer. Could you talk about just kind of just take us through that case and the work that you did to break that story?
Absolutely. Again, this was the work of our lead investigative reporter, Dylan Collier, who was rather proud of this story. As you said, a now retired internal affairs investigator talked about allegations of sexual misconduct between two members of the San Antonio police force, and came to us after his retirement because he felt like it got swept under the rug, and felt that not only was it being swept under the rug, but he was verbally told because it would damage the reputation of this department. I have the story right here, and I kind of want to read a part that when back on October 10th of 2018, KSET received a letter from San Antonio City Attorney Andy Segovia claiming the actions of the internal investigator for retired Jones amounted to a felony and that the city would hold KSET and its parent company liable if the station proceeded with the story based on information provided by Jones. However, through our attorney, we responded that the section of the Texas Penal Code referenced by Segovia in his letter does not apply to the media and that the media's right to gather and report information are protected by the First Amendment. Long story short, we reported the story and we were not sued. So there was no, the intimidation factor from city, government, police, it's something that we encounter, quite a bit. And I kind of want to talk about, my role as a newsroom leader, as a manager. One of the toughest obstacles is training journalists, because we all, as journalists, should all continually be trained and continually want to learn and continually look at things with a critical eye. And that has become, a tough thing to do, but necessary. And I'm so glad at these kind of chances to do that with panels like this, because it really does, it reinvigorates me, as someone who leads a newsroom to help, that level of journalistic integrity. It gets harder, for the spirit of this session when we talk about the struggles, because, I was talking about this at lunch, and there is a lot of shift in the newsroom. There's people who leave and go more frequently than not, and so sometimes it's hard for these journalists to get the correct kind of sourcing, to get as Rachel from Chris had told me, to build those roots in the community that you take for granted for longtime journalists. So that has been a struggle as far as a newsroom leader is maintaining that. But I appreciate opportunities like this, and I appreciate, quite frankly, any guidance that I could take on that front. I know it wasn't specifically about that story, but I did want to make sure that point came across.
No, thank you for doing that. Okay, let's look ahead to the legislative session, one of our favorite subjects, right? We've talked a lot in very previous panels, and obviously we had legislators talking about specific things that they wanted to work on. We've talked about whether it's in-custody deaths or the dead suspects loophole. We've talked about the date of birth issue. We've talked about searchable and sortable databases. I mean, from your perspective, in the work that you do, kind of, obviously we may be talking about, maybe some of this is a bit pie in the sky, but let's just talk about kind of what you're hoping to see out of the legislative session. What do you think should be our priorities as journalists covering these important stories and what you need? We've also talked about like staffing at open records offices and stuff like that too. So this is a question for the full panel. Just kind of looking ahead to the legislative session, what do you see as like kind of as top of mind for you from a transparency standpoint?
If I go? I'm really interested to see, and I'd be interested to talk to any records custodians after this, or if they want to ask a question about whether there are going to be investments in the public records offices of state agencies during the legislative session, whether the appointed or elected heads of those agencies are asking for that money, whether it's needed, whether that's actually the fix for some agencies that I know have received a lot more requests than in the past, like whether we're investing in that. And I think more than this, maybe this is too like negative Nancy, but rather than expanding or improving on the records laws, I think I always am looking out more for things that could pull us back, more restrictions. A couple sessions ago, there was a bill that passed that basically more or less made most legislative communications private, and it was passed just before redistricting. And there was very little debate on it, and it passed. And that, was something that I think the Tribune wrote a story about it when they caught it right before it was signed into law. But that was the only story that I saw, and we didn't write about it. We didn't see it. Last session, there was an attempt to tack on an amendment to a bill that was billed as a ethics cleanup bill, which, if you ever hear that, red flag, that would have taken the personal financial disclosure forms that the Texas Ethics Commission gets and basically take all of the numbers out of it. So you wouldn't have to say how much stock you owned in a company, or how much compensation you received if you were a director on a board, or you wouldn't even have to say you were a director on a board unless you were a senior director on a board. And this was just an amendment that was being thrown onto a cleanup bill, and I happened to be sitting in the House watching a different bill, and started tweeting about it. So these are things that I think fly under the radar a lot because, they're maybe not seen as sexy or the issue of the day or whatever, but they really affect our access to records. So for me, it's more keeping your eyes open for attempts to make access more restricted. And that requires manpower, and it requires, either by journalists or by people out in the community watching and reading bills and being aware and invested in the process.
Before we get to changing laws and altering laws, this is maybe too pie in the sky, but I would just hope that the people who work at the Dome and in state offices would just more and more have a spirit of transparency and a spirit of openness. And we do encounter that, fortunately, as journalists. I know that there are records clerks I can call or custodian of records I can call on the phone and say, you and I both know that PDF on your desktop is public information. Do you mind dragging and dropping it into an email and sending it my way? And many of them sometimes will say, yes, of course. And I do know that that's very much public information. So here you go. And frankly, we need more of that because while there are laws in place that regulate all of this, I think if we just have more of an air of transparency, that will help all of us in the long run. With one specific thing I wish would get addressed, and I know it's not at necessarily the top of our list, which, by the way, I support addressing the dead suspect loophole and the birth date issue that I know we've been talking about all day. But one thing that I have repeatedly run up against here in the city of Austin, particularly with the City of Austin Police Department, is the inability to learn about an investigation, an internal investigation involving a police officer if he or she quits or retires even during the pendency of that investigation before there is a resolution to that investigation. All of those records, because the Austin Police Department works under the state civil service law, all of those records are confidential because they did not result in at least a one-day suspension, which is the threshold for being able to obtain information. So certainly going forward, I would hope that is something that could be addressed in the future by our lawmakers. But really, I think just the mindset among our agencies could be really important going forward and useful.
I'm playing off that, and I had another thought in mind, but I kind of playing off what you said and after what Representative Hunter said during lunch, so many new faces in the Capitol that you hope that is what can come out. That spirit that you talked about. But another thing that I a great question asked at that luncheon by Rachel. This is the punishment for sitting next to me at lunch. Was about, what's the consequences for continually violating, or continually just skirting around the open records request if they're not fulfilled, in the way that is fit. I can tell you now, I'll be watching Chris to see that answer, Chris TV and Corpus to see that answer. But I think that was a very, very valid question that, I would like to hear an answer to. I think that is something that, without getting specific about legislation, what can be done for when this doesn't happen in a way that it should?
Okay, I want to end on a note of inspiration before we go to audience questions. We've got a lot of students here, and that's really inspiring, and I'm grateful that you all are here. Thank you for being here. I'm going to ask the panel, to offer a piece of advice, to these budding journalists about, what they should be thinking about, what they should be doing, things that you may have wished you had known when you were at their stage. Any kind of helpful advice that you think that you would want to pass on, and then we'll go to audience questions.
I would just say, despite the tough times that we live in, and by the way, they can be really, really tough at times. I mean, we know that public trust in journalism has been so diminished. Obviously, there are business concerns that we all live and work in every day. But as I sit here, after I'm now in my 23rd year of journalism here in Texas, I just have to say that in my mind, there is no more noble profession than what we do every day. And that increasingly, with each passing minute, we are seeing the importance and of journalism and why it is so important, not only to the vibrancy of our communities and of our state, but also our nation at a time when democracy in many ways is under attack. So I would say for young journalists or college students or someone thinking about the profession, there is a way to be successful despite what may seem, in reality, I guess, is a narrowing of opportunities out there. At the same time, we need strong journalists now more than ever. So join us, please.
I wish someone had told me when I was younger to advocate more for myself, and sometimes that means asking for help and not feeling like you can't ask for help. And I mean, like, of strangers that you've never met or people in your newsroom. Like, don't not do that. I mean, there is institutional knowledge left in newsrooms or at your universities, and people want to help you. So reach out. And if you don't get an email right away, it's not because they've rebuffed you. Sometimes they just forget, and then it gets buried, so reach out again. I wish someone had told me to ask for more money. I know that we don't get into this business for money, but we also fail to ask for it a lot. We fail to ask for raises or more vacation or an extra week off the books. And what else do I wish people would local journalism is really important. And I think it's great that we have, the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post and national and international news, but you can stay local and make a huge impact and positive one for your community. And you can actually see people helped in front of your face. And that's what keeps me here and keeps me invigorated through, the financial struggles of this industry and, the hate mail and all that kind of stuff. So consider going someplace you might not have. Consider going someplace smaller or someplace you never really thought you'd move, but maybe it's an interesting job and you might be really, really pleasantly surprised.
This is going to be a tough act to follow. I have a different path to the position I am in now. I was a college dropout. because I had already started working at KSET, and the demands of that job overwhelmed me, and I couldn't. One of them had to give, and unfortunately, it was school. So that is something that when I look back, that is something I've always kind of admired of people who are in school, because, I always kind of say, stay in school as long as you can, because it's scary out there. I had so much advice, though, in that newsroom, and that taught me so much about life. And just not to get too personal, but I was also a new father at the age of 19. So it was a very scary time, to be in this business. And quite frankly, anyone who would look over as you said, the finances, nobody gets into this job to get rich, would probably say, this isn't the best path to go down if you're a struggling father trying to make ends meet. But here we are. I would highly recommend finding a journalist who you admire, following their work. What makes him so unique? What makes that person so unique that got you into the business? Always check in with yourself. Why would you want to get into this business? It can sometimes be, a lot of times can be, quite hard, especially in this day and age. But as Tony said, we need journalists. This is a free press. This is something that isn't common around the world. This is what makes this country, work when it does. It is I always say I'm the luckiest SOB to be in this position, because quite frankly, sometimes I feel like, the imposter syndrome kicks in, and that's normal. Recognizing those emotions and realizing why you did this. But also, we don't sell products, not that there's anything wrong with that. We talk about the truth. I mean, think about that. That is what we are here, representatives of the truth, representatives of giving voice to the voiceless, holding those accountable. It's quite an honor to be in that position. It's times like these when I see and I have these conversations, with you, and it reinvigorates me to continue to do this. And it's a lucky position to be in, and I certainly don't take that for granted. And I will say this, I'm out there. If anybody wants some guidance, career, or just want to vent, I'm easy to find. So, good luck if you are choosing to go down this path, because it's a very important path.
Thank you, each and every one of you. Amazing. We're going to open it up to questions. If you can, just raise your hand if you have a question. I'll call on you. Just call out your question, use your outside voice, and I will repeat the question and then pass it on to the panels. The question was related to covering so much difficult, hard-hitting topics, and just the whole aspect of the toll that can take, and how do you deal with that and manage, and will this continue to be the case in the profession that we're in?
Jacqueline, I just want to say, every time I talk to a college class now, someone always asks that question, and I'm so delighted to get that question, because I want you to know, when I first started in the industry, we did not talk about that. I mean, it was buck up, go do your job. I can remember very difficult things that I covered early in my career, and it would have been nice had we talked about this more. But our profession has evolved in this way, and I'm so extremely glad that it is. I think there are a number of different ways, personally, that after covering a traumatic event, a mass shooting, for example, that I do think it's really important that we take care of ourselves. And I think a lot of that is very individual. But I always tell people to, know what you like to doing, know what is relaxing to you, know kind of going into it in advance what good self-care looks like to you, if that means going for a run, or I have a friend who is a knitter. But I think knowing that part of yourself in advance of something traumatic happening and you being on the front lines of that is really, really important. But I have found that good self-care is so vital in terms of sustaining ourselves, because unfortunately we are living and working in a time now when we never know when the next tragedy is around the corner, what it's going to be, where it's going to be, and how it might impact us in a really, really profound and meaningful way. One other just quick thing that I'll say about that. You know, my mother is a more stoic person, but she said to me several years ago something that really made me feel so totally seen by her, and that she really understood the line of work I'm in. She said, you know, to really do a good job covering these things, you really do have to feel it, don't you? And I thought she really is seeing something there that is absolutely true. So, you know, we want to in many ways be detached, but at the same time, I think really walking in the shoes of a survivor or someone who has been through a really traumatic experience themselves is so important to conveying the emotion, and so important to our storytelling.
Playing off exactly what you just said, talking about work-life balance, but meditation has been a big help for me, and I highly recommend it because of the things you just said. It flexes that empathy muscle that makes you a better journalist, that lets you, as you said, walk in those shoes and understand and become a more well-rounded person. You know, I'm a newsroom manager. I have to be held accountable for work-life balance. Those aren't just buzzwords. You know, I want to echo here what Laura said. Know your worth. When you walk into a newsroom, know what you want. You're not always going to get what you want, but give yourself a path and know when, you know, recognize what may not be the situation that fits you best. You know, I work in television, you know, and there is that overnight shift. There is that midnight alarm clock, you know, and that, if you haven't done that, boy, that'll add some years to your life. But it's most likely going to be part of your journey if television is your path. Knowing that may be the case, that you know, and being aware of that. And if it's something that as you get 2-3 jobs in, you know, you can say, this is not something I'm seeking right now. I'd like to see if I can get banker's hours. It took me 15 years to get banker's hours, but it does take a while. But being true to yourself, being self-aware, occasionally going into your, you know, the parking lot, out and go into your truck and having a nice cry. I'm not talking about me, never, but, you know, doing stuff like that just to kind of we're all human, you know, and I always make sure when I'm talking to fellow journalists, be sure to show yourself some grace. You know, that's important to any line of work that you're getting into.
When I figure out how to do it, I'll let you know. I struggle with this a lot. You know, I'm single. I don't have children, so I'm one of those people that has allowed the journalism identity mind meld to happen, where it's like, well, you know, it's 10 o'clock. I'm still on Twitter and I'm still sitting on the TV relaxing, but not really, because you're fully engaged all the time. And that's something that is completely in these 6 inches, right? I could disengage, but I'm not. So that's something I've been working on. I'm trying to think of practical suggestions for when you go into the field. You know, as a young reporter, you're assigned a lot of things usually, and a lot of them can be really negative. You know, if you like start out in cops, which is got to be the toughest beat, maybe, I think. Tony knows. you can advocate for yourself for happy stories. You know, people like happy stories. People like inspirational stories. Or try to find something uplifting in a story that can seem otherwise depressing. I recently wrote about LGBT people leaving Texas after the Roe ruling because they're worried about the next ruling that might affect them in a state like this. And I asked each couple I talked to, has anything good come out of the discussions that you've had about these life changes? And every single one of them had something to say. And it was just a little one sentence thing, but it helped me too, selfishly, because it was a little uplifting note. And then I wrote, you know, be a human, don't push yourself. We've had a lot of burnout in this industry, and it's the reason why we don't have as much institutional knowledge, and that hurts credibility, it hurts the quality of our stories, and if we're gonna keep people, you know, we and our bosses, we all need to be better at taking time off and asking for it and not being embarrassed to be seen as, you know, not strong enough.
If I could just quickly build on everything that was said too, like this is also something as you're looking for your next job or you're talking with an employer, just remember that you're interviewing them as well as they're interviewing you too, to make sure that they're addressing things that you're bringing up too about care, about what they're doing to support their teams, whether it's about, things, and it's also about training and things like that, so that you're feeling like you're being invested in your career development too. So just to add on to that, these are things that as this industry is facing more of a reckoning about how it's operated and how it will operate in the future as people leave the industry, I think this is something that more organizations are really kind of understanding and working on too. So, and I think that's really something that we as managers need to be held accountable for too, is what we're doing to make sure that our teams that we rely on, who to do really difficult work, are also feeling that they're not doing it just for reasons that they're also being invested in and investing in a career that they feel is rewarding, and that they feel are doing it with colleagues who care about them and respect them and value them. Okay, so just to repeat, though, what I think is a two-part question, which is the aspect of verification of documents and also the ethical question that you're asking yourself in determining what to publish for the public to see.
Well, certainly verification is crucial. What I've typically done in the past when I've gotten information that someone gave me that perhaps they shouldn't have is at least confirm it through another source, like the contents of it. So source A may be the provider, but source B and C maybe didn't provide it, but know the contents of it, know the style of it. And so I think one way is to have that conversation with additional sources. But yes, I mean, I think walking out or publishing just a piece of information that someone gave you can be very, very tricky unless there is additional corroboration of that information. In terms of what to publish or not, I mean, I think that can be very case specific. I tend to always sort of as a starting point lean toward the side of publishing, because I think that is in general what we should do, and that we should always be biased toward publishing, but obviously recognizing that there are situations when maybe we don't want to do that. Obviously, too, sometimes confidential information that we are given through sources may have some sort of markings on them, or a stamp on them in some way that may identify the source. That is always a question that we deal with, and a potential issue that we deal with.
Great.
I'll just add, we have a really strict policy for unnamed sources in our stories, very strict. And I like that. Things will get killed because they don't meet that threshold. And if we're going to deal with a story like that, then it's usually lawyered. And I know not every outlet has, someone to contract with, but yeah. So, just because we want to make sure that we don't have blinders on to something there. And also a lot of it is, the source itself. If I can't corroborate something according to our policy with at least 2 other people who have direct knowledge, and I don't mean heard it from someone else, but saw the document, held the document, then we have to have a serious conversation about that piece of information that was provided, who provided it. Are there outside experts we can run that information by to judge its quality, to judge its efficacy, if it's that kind of thing? For me, it's actually been very elucidating, those conversations, and helpful for me to just make sure that our hands are clean at every stage of the process. But again, it is case specific. So, but I'd love to talk to you more about it afterwards too.
For Tony, related to the Javier Ambler case and the records that you got, how much more difficult was it because of the involvement of Live PD and in their involvement in covering the Williamson County?
In terms of our ultimate access to the video, the way that happened was we did our initial request in February. Williamson County appealed it to the Attorney General's office. In mid-May, the Attorney General ruled that at least some information, very limited information, had to be made public. When I got that information, I was able to substantiate, it was a portion of an offense report, that Live PD was involved, that they were riding out with the deputies. And so that very much intensified my interest in learning more about what happened. I began asking at that point for the Austin Police Department and the local DA, the then DA here in Travis County, to release the video. I was allowed to view the video in a private setting just for my own sort of, reporting. And after I saw the video, it ignited my interest in getting it even more. Keep in mind, and this was really important as well, in the middle of this reporting, as it was happening, in late May 2020, George Floyd was murdered in Minneapolis. And so all of this was kind of happening at one time. And I can remember an official who I was negotiating with to release the video to me. I can remember that official saying, I'm afraid if we release it to you, the city, is gonna blow up. And I remember very distinctly saying, if you don't give it to me, and we describe it, and we describe how you're refusing to release it, the city may explode. And ultimately, again, there was just a lot of back and forth. Maybe this is TMI, but I'll never forget this moment. It was the first weekend in June. The protest here in Austin, the social justice protests were very intense. There was a lot of energy around the protest. We're in the middle of the pandemic. And I'll always remember this. I'll never forget it. My husband and I were driving to some friend's house on a Saturday evening to have, outdoor dinner with them. And at 7:00 on a Saturday night, I got a phone call from the city of Austin that said, the video is yours. Were we transferring it to you right now? Like, why it happened at 7:00 on a Saturday night, I'll never know, but I didn't ask questions. And so, needless to say, that backyard dinner was completely changed. I'm sorry? Oh, sorry. I thought somebody said something. So anyway, that's sort of how that went. But again, it was just a really intense negotiation to try to get that information. And ultimately, law enforcement had the discretion, and in my estimation, obviously, they made the right decision by releasing it.
Can I say one more thing,
Please.
just generally about
Please.
records? On 2 panels before this, there was a records custodian who said something about people who file records requests and then, don't even ever pick up the records, or they don't follow through. I file a lot of records requests, so apologies to the custodians in the office or in the audience. But I have had some limited success with challenging the agency or the entity that's trying to withhold those records through the process. I mean, there are people working in the records office, in the AG's office, who've been there for years and decades. And if you take the time, the process allows you as the requester, after they say it's been 10 days, we're not going to give you these records because of these reasons, you can respond and file your own letter and say this is why that's not the case. And records rulings like the Uvalde one, sorry, keep wanting to bring it up, show explicitly how the agency feels about the confidentiality or lack thereof of certain records. I mean, they say this record cannot be withheld under this because of X, Y, and Z. And you can cite this records ruling to say, now you can't withhold it for me in this other situation. So doing your job as a reporter, as that records custodian said, and making sure you're following up, you're filing appeals where you think you might have some argument to, on your side. And, it's only happened to me maybe 3 times, but I've won those appeals and I get the records. I got hypnosis videos from DPS. They were trying to keep hypnosis videos from us, right? Cops doing hypnosis happens. And they didn't want us to give those videos. We appealed, we got the videos. So it's a lot of extra work. But you can create a template and you'll show those records custodians that you're following through too. And they have to read your argument, and sometimes you get lucky and you hit on a part of the law where there's some wiggle room and you win. So don't give up. No, so they sent it to the agency. They said, it's been 10 days, we're not going to give you this for, usually now they just cite the entire records law, right? Then after 15 more days, they file their detailed report and they say, section 108 point blah, blah. And then that's when you can file a letter that says, they said X, Y, and Z, I'm challenging this provision because of this, I'm citing this court ruling or this whatever, and you have to send it by snail mail, you have to send it in the mail to the AG's office, but it's part of the process, and sometimes it works. And sometimes you don't need to appeal and win still because they'll just side with you. But I think sometimes you can make that extra argument and it may help.
You actually don't have to submit it via mail.
Oh, well, there you go. I didn't even know that. You can submit it electronically.
Okay, we are at our time. So please join me in thanking Tony, Lauren, and Mario for this conversation.